Hey folks, this is Lens, also known as Audible Agent, and I wanted to follow up on my last video where I picked the ASSA 6000 with gins. I want to do a deep dive. I want to go into as much of the details I possibly can about what I learned. And just a heads up, I think I'm going to be splitting this into a series of videos. Today's video, we're going to be focusing on just picking the sidebar. So what to expect in this video. I'm going to do a detailed overview of each of the components of the sidebar. I'm going to discuss the tools that I used. I will discuss briefly how to navigate the lock with your pick, and then I will discuss the methods and tips and tricks if I have any. So hopefully this is an informative video for you, and let's get into it. Okay, for the overview of the components, let's start with the key and take notice of the features and cuts on this key. You can see you have kind of what you would expect from a normal pin tumbler key. You've got the cuts on the top that correspond to pin heights, but there's also this lower section down here. And this is what interacts with the sidebar pins. Basically, there are 5 sidebar pins, and these cuts correspond to different heights that each side pin needs to be lifted. In my case, we have kind of a very high lift, somewhere right about there. We have sort of a medium lift here, a low lift, and then this is 2 pins side by side that are also as high as that very first one. When you insert the key into the plug, you are going to be basically interacting with these sidebar pins. These are going to rise up and down. There's a little spring on top of each one, and there's a cutout on the side of each pin that is the true gate. In addition to that, you have several false gates on each pin. And when all of these pins are at the correct height to match the corresponding cutouts on the sidebar, this sidebar will recess completely. So right now, you can see all the pins are kind of just hanging loose. They're not at the right height, and this sidebar will not fully depress. Now if I take the key and manipulate my way into it, kind of tricky because you gotta push the key pins down a little bit when it's outside of the lock like this. Give me 1 second here. Okay. You can probably see that those side pins are up in the plug now at different heights. And as a result, when I push down on this sidebar, it fully recesses in. And that allows this plug to turn inside the cylinder of the lock, or whatever housing it is in. Let's take a closer look at some of these smaller components. By the way, tip, if you're ever taking apart the plug and you're about to remove the side pins, make sure you have your thumb over them as you pull the key out. Otherwise, the side pins will go flying, and they have really tiny springs, and they're a real pain to find. Okay, I'm going to grab the sidebar. By the way, the sidebar has 2 springs. Take a little close up there. You can see the spring on the left and the spring on the right. And in the middle, you can actually see the springs for each of the side pins. But what I wanted to show is this sidebar. And you can probably see there are some features there on each of these half circle chambers. There's a little shelf. And that shelf corresponds to the height that the pin needs to be lifted so that the true gate matches that. Let's take a look at one of the side pins. Let's pull this out. Okay. If you see here, you have 1, 2, 3, 4 shallower gates, and that one in the middle is the true gate. Every side pin in the 6K looks exactly the same. They all have the same number of false gates and a true gate right in the middle. The thing that varies the height is the sidebar itself, what I was just showing you. So there's a close-up of the components. and let's move on to some other topics. Okay, let's talk about the tools that I use to pick the sidebar. First, let's talk about the tension wrench. And in this case, it's actually 2 tension wrenches stacked together. I'm holding it together just with a bit of heat shrink tube. Works really well. But what I want to show you is that in the plug, in the keyway, this is a really tight fit. Yeah, there's a little bit of wiggle room, but for the most part, this gives me all the control I need. And just for sake of measurement, the stack of these 2 wrenches measures 1.4 millimeters. So if you could get something close to that, maybe just a smidge thicker, that's going to work really well for you in controlling this plug rotation. In addition, we need to talk about what pick to use. And I will say I started off using one of these Sparrows flags. It worked okay for me, but honestly, I had a really hard time getting any sort of sensation of feel from the states of the different side pins. And I think that's down to a couple different factors. One, I just don't think the metal on the Sparrows is super rigid. Seems to flex a lot when you apply torsion to it. And in addition, these plastic handles weren't doing me any favors in terms of getting any feedback through the pick. I did try multi-pick, and this is much better. However, I didn't actually get these until I was well on my way in picking the 6K, and I decided to stick to something that was working better for me. However, I would say if you have these, I would recommend going with something like this. You've got pretty much an all metal on metal construction. You're going to get really good feedback. And I think the steel used for these picks is just better. So you're going to get pretty good feedback from this. So if you have these, they're pretty expensive if you don't, but if you do have these, look to try and use these. Instead, what I used was actually this Southward pick that, man, I bought this set of picks a really long time ago. But I chose this because I was looking for something that was a little bit more rigid. And in fact, this flag has kind of one of those square profiles, giving it more rigidity. But it was also an all metal construction. So the only issue with it was that the shape of the tip wasn't quite to my liking. I actually ground this tip down a little bit. And so it's a little bit flatter and narrower towards the tip, kind of more of a knife blade shape, and then it thickens up as it moves towards the back. In addition, just for the sake of comfort, I was resting my finger on this edge a lot, and that edge was pretty sharp, so I kind of smoothed out that edge. But the core feature of this pick is that it's rigid, and that is super, super important, in my opinion, when trying to read the states of the different pins, trying to tell whether or not they're jiggling, whether or not they're super rigid, etc. So make sure you pay attention to the construction of your flag when choosing it, and choose one that is as rigid as possible. And one other note, the overall width from the tip of this flag to the back can't be too wide. And actually, I'm just going to quickly measure this and let you know what that is. In my case, it is about 2.9 millimeters, let's say. That seems to be a pretty good width for getting into the keyway and navigating through each of the side pin chambers so that you can manipulate those side pins. And real quick too, the reason I have sort of a knife edge is just so I can kind of scoop under each side pin a little bit more easily. All right, let's quickly talk about how to navigate the side of the lock where the side pins are so that you know which chamber you're in. So I'm going to show you something from the underside. So I've taken everything out of this plug, and these are the 5 side pin chambers. When you're moving your pick inside of the plug, what you want to try to do is look for that little edge of each side pin chamber and count. So 1, 2, 3. Obviously, you would be doing it like this, and you would have, you know, the cylinder to rest your pick against the bottom of, but it's the same thing. You move it in, you feel for that first chamber, that little part that juts out. I'm on chamber 1. Move it to the right a little bit, 2. Move it to the right again, push it forward, chamber 3. That is the best way that I've found to navigate and know where you're at and keep orientation within this plug. So use that little feature of the chamber and count your way down the pin stacks. And if you lose count, just pull your pick all the way out and start over again. There's only 5 chambers, easy enough to count from 1 to 5. So use that as your kind of marker for where you're at in the lock. All right, let's talk a little bit more about the tensioning. Obviously, when you're picking a lock like this, you have the option to tension counterclockwise or clockwise. In this particular case, with this ASSA 6000, I would recommend that you tension counterclockwise for one very specific reason. The sidebar only exists on one side of the lock, which is the left side. And that sidebar, being spring-loaded, is applying counter pressure to the direction in which you are tensioning the lock. And that's helpful when you are trying to let off tension very gently, because tension control is the name of the game in picking this lock, not only for the sidebar pins, but also for the top pins. So stick with counterclockwise tension until you can get the lock picked. And maybe at that point you play with regular clockwise tensioning just as a bigger challenge. In addition, I should note that a lot of people, probably most people, prefer to use 2 tension wrenches. They'll stick one on top and one here in the right that kind of angles off to the side, and they hold on to those 2 so that they have perfect exact control over the plug and its specific rotation. If that works for you, do it. And in that case, it probably doesn't matter much which direction you tension. It's just not my preferred way of picking. And so I was able to make it work with just essentially 1 tension wrench. Yes, it's 2 tied together, but without having to use a second tension wrench, which was kind of getting in the way of the keyway, and I just found kind of a pain to manage, to be honest. So give this a shot and let that sidebar, the sidebar and its springs help you in backing off tension in a controlled manner so that you can set each of the pins individually. So just to reiterate, we are just talking about the side pins today and the sidebar. So where do you start in picking this lock? I would recommend you start with just the sidebar and with just 1 pin in the sidebar populated. That's what I have set up here. I have pin number 4 as the only pin in this entire lock on the sidebar. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to count when navigating. So 1 chamber, 2 chamber, 3 chamber. Oh, I think I messed up. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, I'm in the 4th chamber. I'm under the pin. I can feel it. I'm just giving it a little gentle nudge. I can feel it's there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to learn how many clicks of this pin it takes before I get the open. So let's see. 1, letting off a little tension. 2, letting off tension. 3. Let's take a look at that key again. So we said we were in chamber number 4. It's right about there. That's that high lift pin. And this has 3 of those high lift pins, and we know those side pins are all the exact same shape, same number of false gates, same height. So from that, I can deduce that 3 of the pins in my lock take 3 clicks to get to the true gate. That's super useful information. However, if yours is all over the place, and to be honest, I think there are more than 3 possible cuts on the sidebar key. I believe there are 5. Don't quote me on that. What I would still do is pin by pin, chamber each one in isolation, learn the number of clicks you hear before you get the open, and write that down for each chamber. And while you're at it, make sure from that point forward, you're keeping track of which pin goes with which chamber, because binding order matters too. And we'll get more into the binding order later on, but if you're going to start doing this, keep track of your pins and what chambers they go in. Okay, still in the same situation. I just have the 1 pin chambered in chamber 4, But I wanted to talk a little bit more about the tension control because I kind of went through that pretty quickly. So what am I doing? Okay, I am applying pretty heavy tension right now. I'm finding my way to chamber 4, and I'm going to start lifting. And by lifting, I mean I'm kind of applying a little bit of upward pressure, but also a little bit of rotational pressure. And I'm seeing if that pin's going to move for me. And with the amount of tension I have right now, it doesn't really want to, although I probably could force it. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to let off the pressure I'm applying to the tension wrench until that pin gives. It gives me one click. And then I'm right back on the pressure on the tension wrench, keeping that pin in place. And this is kind of the motion you're going to repeat pretty much throughout the entire pick of this lock. It sort of includes the gins as well. You are applying a little bit of pressure under the pin while letting off tension until that pin either starts to give or just does give. Let it click once, and then get back on the tension. Okay, so you've done what I just explained. You went through a pin at a time, so chambers 1 through 5, one pin at a time. You learned the click count before you got the lock open with just the sidebar for each one of those pins, and you wrote that down. And maybe you've memorized it. What's next? The next thing I'd recommend is starting to populate it with more pins. So start with pins 2, 3, and 4. So essentially the middle pins out of the set of 5. You'll populate 3 of them. And start trying to get the lock open based on what you know. Obviously, you only know the click count, but what about the binding order? You need to start learning the binding order. So play with those 3 pins, get comfortable with getting it picked, note down the binding order, and it may be that the binding order changes as you move up gate by gate, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just make sure you kind of have the pattern down. You know, write it down, memorize it, do whatever you need to do. And then either introduce a 4th pin, which I wouldn't recommend because you kind of create an unsymmetrical setup in the lock, and I think that could possibly teach you the wrong things. I think it would be better to just go ahead and jump to 5. However, I will say during the learning process for me in this lock, there were plenty of times where I had unsymmetrical layouts in the sidebar pins, just so I could figure out what the heck was going on. So try that method, see how it works for you. I certainly think it's a very systematic and methodical way of learning the nuances of a particular lock, and that should help you in learning to pick the sidebar. If you take a look at the 2 videos I have on picking this ASSA 6000 with gins, when I'm picking the sidebar, you might notice that I am able to get away with picking each pin one at a time without having to go between them as I hit gates. I would basically just get on the pin that I knew was the binder, lift it up based on the number of clicks, and try to leave it there. And, you know, when I first started picking this lock, I was aware that the ping-ponging issue was really common. That's where you move one pin up one gate, and then another one falls that you had previously set, and you're playing this game of ping-pong over and over again. I don't know if it's just the fact that this lock started to break in, or if it was my tension control that got better. But at a certain point in time, I was able to pick each pin, get it to the number of clicks or the right height, and have it stay there for pretty much the rest of the pick. So I could move on to the other pins, get those set to the right height. And then once I knew they were all kind of in the right position, it usually just required a little bit of nudge on one binding pin before that sidebar was picked. So all of this is to say that if you can get away with getting each pin set to the true gate without moving on to the next one, go that route because that's certainly easier. Just pay attention for the sounds of falling pins so that you can keep note of that, and the fact that you may have to go back and revisit a pin that had previously been set but has subsequently fallen down. I was just talking about whether or not it's possible that this lock kind of broke in and wore down. I'm sort of tempted to believe that's the case because when I was showing you picking this one pin earlier on, you know, I got under it, I'm applying heavy tension, it doesn't want to move, so I let off a little bit of tension. But if I'm honest, I can stay on that tension, you know, it's pretty heavy tension, and I can sort of force this pin up. I'm letting off just a little bit of tension, but for the most part, I'm able to just force that pin up one gate at a time. Your mileage may vary on this. You know, I have an ASSA 6000 barrels that I'm working on right now. That thing is refurbished and everything is super sharp. And I can't get away with that as easily as I can with this lock. And I should note that this lock was new when I bought it, and it looks pretty worn now, and that's because of 1 month of working on it. But if you can, you know, if you're worried about dropping other pins, try keeping the tension higher so that you keep those pins set where you want them, and maybe just try using a little bit of force. We're not talking about, you know, going gorilla on this and you know, really bending your pick or bending your tension wrench tremendously. Just maybe a little bit more force than you thought you needed might be able to get those pins moved up one gate at a time. Just a little tip. All right, this next tip may not actually be a tip. It may be completely fabricated in my mind, but I want to mention it anyway. And it's probably going to be a little bit hard to demonstrate. But let's say you are working with the pin in its chamber and you get under it. You might not know exactly where you are under it. You might be on this right side. In which case, you know, you're going to be applying some upward pressure, but also some rotational pressure. So in this situation, when you're kind of on the right side of the pin, I think you're getting more upward movement. And, you know, these gates are cut so square to each other that you're really just ramming the gate up into the sidebar, and it's not going to have a good chance of getting past it. So my tip is to try to get your flag a little bit more to the left of the pin and use a little bit more rotation to kind of move the left side of the pin outward to the right a little bit. And doing that, in theory, you create a little bit of a gap, an opening where the gate is, and allow this pin to more easily slide past the sidebar notch and get into the next gate. It's something I started doing when picking this lock, and that's when I started noticing that I wasn't really having the ping-ponging issue. However, I will say it hasn't been working as well in my ASSA 6000 with barrels. Granted, I think they have slightly different versions of the side pins. I need to double check that, but that's what I've been told. However, just give it a shot. I mean, what's it going to cost you? Nothing. Try getting your flag a little bit more to the left or further into the chamber and apply a little bit more rotational force as you're lifting to try to get that side pin out and over the edge of the sidebar notch so that it can get into the next gate. Okay, and another common technique that people talk about when picking these sidebar pins is, yeah, you're on the tension, you're under the pin, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and they talk about this kind of bouncing technique as you're letting off the tension. I found the bouncing technique to be tremendously helpful when we're talking about the top pins, so the gin drivers in this. But in this lock, honestly, I found it to be more of a hindrance because you have less control when you're sort of bouncing on the pin. And, you know, I'm trying to back off this tension in a controlled manner. So every time I pulse like that, I felt like I would overshoot sometimes on accident just from the pressure of the bounce and cause more pins to fall down than I needed. So using that tip I just taught you before, where you're getting under the left side of the pin and applying a little bit more rotation force than upward force and letting off the tension until that pin gives, that seems to work for me. I'm not going to guarantee it'll work for you, but I think it's worth a try because that's certainly a more controlled manner of setting each pin gate by gate than this sort of bouncing technique, which a lot of people talk about. Okay, so you may have noticed that my techniques that I've explained so far are really good for learning a particular lock, and I'm the first one to call that out myself. You know, I think what I've learned so far about the ASSA 6000 is how to learn to pick this particular lock, and maybe I've picked up a couple new techniques that could be helpful in the next ASSA 6000 or similar lock. But for the most part, I'm learning to pick this specific lock. And I think that's okay. You know, I think we're all just learning, and, you know, we're trying to also potentially, if you're in the LPU system, move up in the belt ranking system. And so how else do you learn? You know, this is a way of learning to pick locks that are new to me, and I'm sure a lot of you do the same thing. So just wanted to call that out real quick. But I guess the thing I wanted to talk about is the jiggle test. You know, we hear a lot about the jiggle test, and I think I got to the point where, you know, I could tell whether or not a pin was set after I got it up a number of clicks. But if I'm honest, even with a rigid pick, it's still pretty hard to tell the difference between a pin that is truly set and a pin that is maybe not in the true gate, is in a false gate, but is not yet binding. You know, those two states, I felt like I didn't have an easy time figuring out the difference between them. What I found helpful was, instead of focusing on this jiggle test, focus more on the pin that is binding the hardest. A pin that is locked up solid, fully rigid, probably needs your attention because it is resting against likely a false gate or is between gates, and that sidebar is applying a ton of pressure on it, preventing it from moving. So rather than spend a bunch of time, I guess, really fine-tuning your jiggle test skills, don't get me wrong, you should learn those eventually. But if you're just trying to make a little progress on this lock, maybe focus more on the pin that's binding hard and moving that up a notch. Or if you've got all of the pins set to the right click count and you didn't hear anything drop and it still hasn't opened the lock, that is especially a good time to apply that knowledge, because usually there's 1 or 2 pins that are still just slightly bound up. And when you get to that state, you're going to go in there and just kind of move your pick up against it. Don't move the pin, just bring your pick up against it until it touches it, and see if you can determine whether or not it's locked up rigid. And if it is, give it just a tiny little gentle nudge and see if you can get anything out of it. More likely than not, that might be the pin that gets you the open. I found that to be the case a lot of times when picking the sidebar in this. There was always one pin that was just barely not fully set, and giving it literally like a thousandth of a millimeter movement was enough to get it fully set and get the sidebar picked. Okay, we talked a little bit about binding order and maintaining the order of your pins. Again, that's super important. Don't lose the order of your pins in their corresponding chambers unless you want to relearn the binding order. But there's something I think I want to call out because I'm not sure how I personally feel about it. You know, if you know the binding order and you can rearrange these side pins and they are of all the same type and makeup, you know, there's no distinguishable features between them, then that means you can reorder them. So in theory, you could reorder these to make them a little bit easier for your circumstances. I'm going to say this is something that crossed my mind. I did not do this, at least not intentionally. When I first picked the 6K on video, I did a pretty bad gut, and when I was gutting, I did not keep the order of the side pins. You know, I didn't keep them organized. And so when I went to reassemble it for my second pick, you might have noticed that my binding order for the side pins changed. That was just something random. You know, I didn't intentionally try to set the side pin order. But that is potentially an option. And, you know, it's something that you could do, especially if you got stuck, because I found that a binding order from back to front or front to back, I think is easiest. And I think that has to do with the fact that, you know, it's how the sidebar is falling into each true gate one at a time. So if you imagine a binding order of 1 through 5, you know, that means we're going to get this first pin up into its true gate. And so the sidebar is probably going to move a little bit that direction. The next optimal pin to be binding is pin number 2. So then you can also gradually move that into the true gate a little bit more, and so on down the line. You know, compare that to a situation where you have pins 1 and 4 as the first 2 binders. Okay, set pin 1, set pin 4. While pins 2 and 3 are still going to block this sidebar from making any sort of lateral movement, which means they are just barely hanging on to pins 1 and 4, which are in the true gate. That's a much harder situation to maintain as you pick the rest of the pins. So this is just something to, I guess, keep in mind and be aware of. And you'll notice I'm a little bit hesitant to even call this out because I'm not suggesting you do this for your actual pick video if you're doing this for LPU. Because honestly, I don't really know what the rules are on something like that. To me, it's a little bit unethical if you were to play with the sidebar pin binding order just to make a lock easier for you to pick, even if it doesn't change how the key operates and how it generally functions. I think that's kind of not in the spirit of the lock picking community. I think you're better off, writing down the binding order as soon as you establish it, maybe using that technique of reordering them when you are just learning. But certainly for a pick video, if you can, and it wasn't an accident like I had where you didn't pay attention and they just got mixed up, try to stick with the original binding order. I think that's, at least for your picking video, I think that's keeping more in the spirit of what lock picking is about and sort of what we're trying to prove on camera about our abilities and our skills. And, it could be that there's actually nothing wrong with that whatsoever in terms of LPU guidelines and picking requirements. I just don't know off the top of my head. And, if you were to reorder these side pins to create a more favorable binding order and you wanted to use that video, I would be super transparent about the fact that you did that and maybe even check with some of the LPU admins and see what their thoughts are on it. But my sense is that if you even have to ask, it's probably not the right thing to do. Okay, this is something else I wanted to demonstrate that I thought was a super useful tool to have in my bag. So I mentioned that 3 of the sidebar pins on here are what I call max lift. I don't know if it's just the shape or width of my flag here, but something I noticed, and again, we still just have sidebar pin number 4 in here, which is one of those max lift cuts. If I apply 0 tension and I take my pick, get under that pin, 1, 2, 3, 4, and I lift it literally as high as I possibly can, lock opens. So if you're in a situation where you don't want to count the clicks, or maybe you forgot the number of clicks for one of these max lift pins, maybe don't worry about it. Maybe just send it up as high as you possibly can, because it seems like that's the right place for that pin to be, for it to be in the true gate. So that applies only to the max lift pins as far as I can tell, but I think that's a super useful tip, and I certainly used it a lot on this lock, which has 3 of those. Okay, I kind of briefly touched on this, but I want to go over it just one more time. So let's say you've got, all 5 sidebar pins in there. You've learned the binding order, you've learned the click counts, and you're picking, and you've got everything where you think it should be based on the click count and the binding order, and you still don't have the open. At that point in time, what I did on this lock was I revisited those max lift pins that we just talked about. I made sure that they were as high as I could possibly get them. And in my case, that left me with only 2 more pins, pins 2 and 3. And what I would do is I would get under those pins one at a time, pin 2, pin 3. And again, I would just lift up gently and just kind of test without trying to move the pin much vertically. Just test to see, is it giving me anything? Sometimes literally just making contact with one of those pins was enough to get it into its true gate and get the lock to open. But when you're in that state where you know for a fact that all of the pins should be at the right height and it still hasn't opened the lock, it means there's just 1 or 2 pins that are a tiny fraction of a millimeter not in place, and you need to give them a little wiggle or a little nudge and you should get the lock open. Okay, I think that's everything. I tried to cover the sidebar in as much detail as I possibly could. Again, look for another video to follow this where I do the same for the gins, just focusing on those and how to pick those in isolation. And then probably a third video where maybe I go into a little bit more detail about what it means to bring the sidebar pins together with the top pins and pick it as a complete package, because that came with its own learnings. But I really hope you found this useful. This is something I'm really trying to do for the LPU community and the lockpicker community in general, is share in greater detail the things I've learned, because it took me a long time to learn them, and I certainly learned from others more than anything, but I have also learned just from trial and error. And yeah, I think I mentioned it before, this lock took me a full month to learn how to pick, and that was with help. So hopefully this gives you a bit of a jump start. Look for my other videos. Look for my video on picking this lock. There's actually 2 of them. I'll link to those in the description. And give me a like if you appreciated this content and you thought it was helpful. I'll continue doing it. Take care.